Welcome to the Unhinged Podcast. My name is Emma Jackson and I am your host on this week's episode where we are going to be discussing the case of Jesse James, the notorious American outlaw. And today is an especially special episode because here he is laughing at me. We have my brother here, Jay, as a guest on today's case.
Hi.
And we are so happy to have him here.
Woo.
So let's get right on into the case. So before we begin with the content, I just want to give a little disclaimer that the following content explores mature themes. So if you are in any way triggered, we encourage you as the Unhinged Podcast to click off, and we will see you in the next episode. All right, let's get on into it. So who was Jesse James? Jesse Woodson James was born on September 5th, 1847, to Kentucky native Zerelda Cole James and her husband, Robert James, a Baptist minister and a slave-owning hemp farmer who had a total of 6 slaves and assisted in founding William Jewell College in Liberty, Missouri. Jesse's father, Robert James, traveled to California to preach in the gold mining camps. However, not long after arriving, he became sick and died. Zerelda and her children Jesse, his brother and future partner in crime Frank, and their younger sister Susan were plunged into immense financial difficulties. In 1852, Zerelda married a wealthy older man named Reuben Samuel and moved in with him. But he disliked the James children, so they were made to live with another family.
Jesse James's brother, Frank's activities with a band of pro-Confederate guerrillas brought the wrath of Union militiamen to the James family. Jesse was severely beaten and his stepfather, Reuben Samuel, was tortured for information. This may have been the spark that set off Jesse's flame. In the spring of 1864, 16-year-old James joined a bloodthirsty guerrilla group led by Bloody Bill Anderson, the leader of a group of bushwhackers. They terrorized pro-Union enemies in the Missouri countryside. Still an impressionable teenager, Jesse participated in multiple atrocities, including the notorious Centralia massacre, in which 22 unarmed Union soldiers and 100 other Union soldiers were murdered. Jesse was identified as one of the members who committed this atrocity, and as punishment, all family members of Jesse and Frank James had to leave Clay County.
Jesse later married his first cousin, Zerelda Mims, who was named after Jesse's own mother. And I don't know, I know it.
Weird.
Yeah, I think it would, even though it's back in the day, I still think it's kind of off. Together they had 2 children, Jesse E. James and Mary James Barr. Jesse was only a teenager when he rode off to join Confederate guerrillas in 1864. He never really stopped fighting the Civil War. Unable to accept the defeat of the secessionist, sorry, I just slipped on my words. On the secessionist cause, Jesse James channeled his fury on banks, trains, and stagecoaches. He loved to call himself a modern Robin Hood, robbing from radical Republicans and giving what he stole back to the poor. So now we're going to move on into the crimes that he actually committed. So Jay, if you want to kick off the Gallatin robbery.
Shortly after noon on December 7th, 1869, Frank and Jesse James walked into a Davies County Savings Association in Gallatin, Missouri. There was 2 men inside the modest 1-story building, the bank cashier and a lawyer named William McDowell. One of the robbers, possibly James, walked up to the cashier and asked to have $100 banknotes changed. As the cashier wrote out a receipt, the robber drew his revolver and fired 2 shots, one into the man's chest and another into his forehead. As McDowell ran for the door, he was shot in the arm. Jesse grabbed a portfolio of bank papers and raced outside. He and Frank rode out of the town pursued by a posse, but they eventually escaped.
The Gallatin robbery set the pattern for many more to come. It was daring. It had motives beyond simple robbery. In this case, the killing of the man who had hunted down Jesse's fellow bushwhacker, Bloody Bill Anderson, during the Civil War. It demanded attention. It resulted in the death of unarmed civilians, and it didn't go according to plan. In this case, Jesse had snatched a collection of worthless paper from the bank, and the man he killed wasn't the intended target. So now we're going to move on. Gigi, if you want to start on the Croydon Bank. Yeah.
Bank robbery. In June 1871, Jesse and members of his gang robbed a bank in Croydon, Iowa, arriving during a speech by noted orator Henry Clay Dean that had drawn most of the town to the local Methodist church. Not content with stealing $6,000, the bandits went to the church and shook the stolen money at the crowd. Furious at being upstaged, the publicity seeking continued when Jesse turned his attention to railroads. He left behind press releases boasting of the crimes. Another part of the galantine pattern was on display during an April 1872 robbery in Kentucky. The lead robber walked in the bank, said "Good evening" to the unarmed cashier, and promptly shot him down. The Kentucky robbery netted little, as the mortally wounded cashier refused to open the bank vault. But whether he made much money or not, each robbery seemed to give Jesse a taste for more. In 1876, that taste would lead to his boldest expedition yet.
In Northfield. So Jesse and his gang robbed banks, stagecoaches, and trains with near impunity in the early 1870s, like we've discussed. They eluded authorities time and time again, aided by Confederate sympathizers. Perhaps Jesse began to believe in his own invincibility when in September 1876, he attempted a bank robbery in Northfield, Minnesota, 500 miles from his normal base of operations. The robbery was a colossal failure. The townspeople had no tolerance for former insurgents. They killed 2 of the robbers on the spot and hunted down the others. Only Jesse and his brother Frank managed to flee, but they were forced to live in Tennessee under aliases.
Jesse was restless, unable to settle down with his wife Zia and son Jesse. Frank began to enjoy the quiet life, but Jesse couldn't help himself. He tried various money-making schemes and bought racehorses, but none of it satisfied his desire for fame.
Jesse returned to crime in 1879, but by then ex-Confederates had taken over Missouri's political reins, and the public had little patience for his banditry. Jesse's new gang, none of them being ex-soldiers, were in it for the money, not the cause, and one of them happily conspired with Missouri's governor to hunt the outlaw down, which is Jesse James in this case, and collect a $10,000 reward. On April 3rd, 1882, Jesse got a bullet in the back of the head. He died with few allies, but in later years, the myths surrounding him grew so strong that it eventually crowded out the inconvenient truths of his own murderous life. Rather than dying in a hail of bullets while robbing a bank or a train, the legendary Jesse James was killed on April 3rd, 1882, while dusting a picture on the wall of his rented home in St. Joseph, Missouri. At the time, his wife and 2 children were in another room. Robert, or Bob Ford, a new recruit in James's gang, was the assassin who shot him in the back of the head. Bob's brother was also present during the shooting. Bob's older brother, Charlie, was a James gang member himself.
Acting through their sister, Martha Bolton, the Fords made contact with Governor Crittenden, and Bob met with him earlier that year on January 13th, 1882. They reached a deal. If Ford kills Jesse, they would receive both the reward money and a pardon for their crimes. Meanwhile, some of Jesse's other gang members had been killed or captured in the face of Crittenden's ruthless pursuit. Infighting and paranoia had also taken its toll on the gang. Dick Liddon, with Bob Ford's help, shot one gang member, Jesse's cousin, and Jesse himself shot Ed Miller and scared away Jim Cummins, Cummins after he began to suspect Cummins of treachery. Ironically, Jesse thought the Ford brothers were the last two people he could trust, so that March, the outlaw invited Bob and Charlie to move into his new house in St. Joseph. The Fords said yes and waited for their chance to strike. They knew they couldn't do anything while Jesse was armed. He'd get the drop on them for sure, so they watched and waited until finally, on April 3rd, Jesse was moved in and out of his house and got so hot that he took off his coat. Afraid of being spotted with his pistols, he removed them as well. Then Jesse stepped on a chair in his living room and reached forward to dust a picture. Bob and Charlie drew their weapons, and Bob put a bullet in the back of Jesse's brain.
After the Fords announced to authorities they'd killed the infamous outlaw, they were convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. However, the governor quickly pardoned them and got the railroad company to pay out the reward. The public was captivated by James's murder, and the Fords quickly began reenacting it in a traveling show. Charlie Ford committed suicide in 1884, while Bob Ford was murdered in a Creede, Colorado saloon in 1894. Following James's passing, there was lingering speculation that he'd faked his own death and someone else was buried in his grave. Over the years, several different men claimed to be Jesse James. As early as 1995, scientists seeking to resolve the question of who was buried in James's grave exhumed his supposed remains from Mount Olivet Cemetery in Kearney, Missouri. The remains had been transferred there in 1902 from the original burial site on the James family farm. After conducting DNA testing, the researchers concluded the exhumed remains were almost certainly those of the 19th century outlaw, Jesse James.
Shortly after the gang's last train robbery on September 7, 1881, at Glendale, Missouri, Jesse moved his family to St. Joseph, Missouri, renting a house on 1318 Lafayette Street on December 24th, 1881. The family settled in under Jesse's assumed name of Tom Howard, with a $10,000 reward over his head. Z tried to get Jesse to take on a more normal life, and Jesse agreed. Right after one last great bank robbery in Platte Country, Missouri, Jesse had finally decided to retire, hopefully with enough money to become a gentleman farmer.
Planning the robbery with Bob and Charles Ford, whom Jesse had worked with in the past, the Ford brothers visited the James home in St. Joseph on the morning of April 3, 1882. Outlining his plans for the robbery with Bob and Charles in the parlor of his home, Jesse noticed that a framed needlepoint picture done by his mother was hanging crookedly on the wall. Standing on a chair to adjust the picture, like JJ had said before, Jesse turned slightly as he heard the sound of Bob Ford's cocked pistol. Bob shot Jesse just below the right ear, and Jesse toppled to the floor dead. He was only 34 years old. So Robert Bob Ford, I'm gonna insert a picture here in the video. At the sound of the gunshot, the children, both of Jesse's children and his wife, ran into the room, being the first to reach him. Z, his wife, followed, trying desperately to stop the blood. Bob Ford was already out of the door, and Charles spent a few moments trying to tell her, but this is Bob's older brother, Charlie, was trying to convince his wife and to tell her how the gun had gone off accidentally. Then he too made a quick exit, running after his brother. Robert Ford killed James for two reasons. The first was that Ford had killed a man by the name of Wood Height in January of 1882. When word of the shooting resulted in Ford's arrest, he informed the officer that he had access to the much-wanted Jesse James. In a deal made secretly with Governor Thomas T. Crittenden, the governor promised Ford a pardon for the Height murder if he would kill James. There was also a $10,000 reward on Jesse's head that Ford hoped to collect.
After his death, Jesse was packed on ice and taken by train to Kearney, where he was displayed and viewed by hundreds of friends, admirers, and curiosity seekers. Later, he was buried on the family farm in a plot near the house so that Gerelda could keep an eye out for trespassers or souvenir hunters. His tombstone read, "In memory of my beloved son, murdered by a traitor and coward whose name is not worthy to appear here."
And that is the short version of the case of the American outlaw and infamous bank robber, Jesse James. So I thank you very much for listening to this week's episode of the Unhinged Podcast. Thank you, Jay, for coming on and guesting this week's episode. It was great to have you. And thanks for sitting down with us, guys. We hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.